Thank you for tuning in for this timely conversation on the latest following Sunday's consequential election in Honduras. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President and Senior Director here at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, and I'm pleased to welcome this stellar group of speakers joining us from Honduras, who will be introduced momentarily. Sunday was a very big day in Honduras, where general elections were held to select the next president, 128 members of Congress, nearly 300 mayors, and 20 representatives to the Central American Parliament. Nearly 3.3 million Hondurans went to the polls following a tense period that drew a lot of international attention, including that of President Trump. The tensions were heightened after the March primaries, which were affected by several logistical hurdles, including delays in delivering materials and opening of polling centers, especially in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, where roughly 40% of the registered voters are located. This was also the first time that Hondurans could vote abroad, and there was concern that not enough actas were sent to polling centers outside of Honduras. These delays triggered finger pointing within the electoral authorities and between them and other public institutions, including the armed forces and the Attorney General's office. One key result was a delay in finalizing the contract for the company known to be responsible for transmitting preliminary results on election night through the TREP. There were also delays in contracts for satellite connectivity and supporting the armed forces in delivering voting materials across the country. These procurement problems came alongside institutional clashes, mutual fraud accusations between party representatives, and judicial cases being opened against the National Electoral Council's opposition councilors. All of this leading up to the vote put the spotlight on Honduras internationally. And in the weeks before Sunday's vote, the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere held its first hearing of the year, calling on all institutions to respect their roles and ensure a free, transparent, and reliable process. The OAS Permanent Council also convened an extraordinary session to discuss the situation. And then, less than 48 hours before the vote, President Trump took to social media to endorse the presidential candidate of the National Party, Titi Afura, while pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president. At ALEC, we've followed these developments closely through a series of weekly social media posts, as well as a memo to the Secretary of State released in the days ahead of the vote, outlining the stakes of the process for the U.S. and offering recommendations for the lead up to the vote. One key point that we raised was the importance of the U.S. sending an ambassador, needing an ambassador in place to steer the next phase of this bilateral relationship. And you could read more at atlanticcouncil.org. In the end, despite some 4,000 incidents reported throughout the day, the elections went ahead mostly peacefully and had been described as a, quote, civic celebration, despite some of the logistical setbacks. International domestic observers are still on the ground monitoring how the vote count unfolds. So far, the National Electoral Council's TREP shows a very tight race between the two main opposition presidential candidates, with margins in some areas as low as 500 votes, constituting essentially a technical draw at this point. Counting continues for other positions. So to help us unpack the preliminary results, the dynamics that shaped the vote, and what to expect next, we have a great panel of experts here with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Maria Fernanda Bosmowski, Director and Central America Lead at ALAC, who will introduce our speakers and moderate the conversation. Thanks again for joining us today. Mafe, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. All three of you are joining us from Honduras, and I'm sure that you have so many other competing priorities. So really, thank you. As we unpack, what should we know after Hondurans have cast their vote? I'm joined by Deborah Ulmer, who is the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Democratic Institute, Giselle Wolosny, the Executive Director of El Milenio Honduras, and last but not least, Rafael Jerez, Coordinator of the Electoral Observation Office of the Honduran Council of Private Enterprise, also known as COEP. So, Deborah, let's go right into it. I would like to ask you about what you've been observing on the ground. How did they unfold it in terms of citizen participation, logistical performance? We've heard from Jason some of the things that came up, but you've been there before. You were there in 2017. What challenges emerged during the weeks leading up to the vote? Just give us a brief overview of what you've been observing.
Good morning, and thank you, Jason, and the team at the Atlantic Council for this opportunity to speak on Honduras. As you opened up, Honduras was barely a blip just a few weeks ago. And there has been a lot of attention, some unwanted attention on the elections. Sunday's election the participation was robust, and the logistical performance was much, much improved from the primaries. One of the main issues, as you mentioned, in the primaries was the late delivery of ballots and other electoral materials to the polling stations, particularly in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula, which are the two largest cities, which made that the opening of the polling stations delayed and the voting much, much delayed. That issue was not widespread on Sunday. The NDI had supported a national election observation effort made up of 30 different organizations from 2 different networks. And they found that the 94% of the polling stations had all the required materials and opened up by 8 a.m. 90% had opened. All the materials were there, and 99%. And in terms of citizen participation, we haven't seen the final turnout numbers, but as of 5 p.m. yesterday, the CNE had reported that more than 2 million voters had indeed voted. That's approximately 6.5 million voters. So the projection right now is to be between 65 and 67% of the votes. But in general, citizens who, went out to vote were able to vote, and the observers found really few cases, isolated cases, where voters were turned away, mostly because their names were not on the register. 96% of the polling stations had no incidents of violence or harassment. There was a lot of fear by citizens and by the national observer groups of colectivos coming out. There were some incidents, there were some isolated incidents, a well-known incident of an international observer here in Tegucigalpa, of colectivos showing up, and we had documented of national observers some incidents of colectivos putting the fear into our observers. 45 observers had quit the week before the elections because of rumors of colectivos coming out, but we had only documented one case in La Paz of the colectivos driving away right at the vote count. I would just say that the NDI supported national observers, deployed approximately 1,000 observers throughout the country. They remained at their polling station throughout the day, collecting and reporting data about the voting conditions, the vote count, and only the presidential results. There's been a lot of concerns about the TREP following the CNE simulation that happened 2 weeks before the elections. And even one of the council members basically saying that the TREP would not work, and the ruling party candidate announcing publicly days before that she would not recognize the TREP results. A lot of concern, right, about what the TREP is or what it's not. And I would just want to state that the TREP is a methodology that's employed by the CNE, by the electoral authorities, to promote public confidence. It's to provide transparency on election night only. The count stopped at 57 because there were no more transmissions. It was slower, but it worked. That is the main difference, I would say, from previous elections. And even in 2021, there were several logistical concerns that did not occur in these elections. But that was overcome by the wide participation, and I believe that will be true this time around.
Thank you, Deborah, for that overview. And I just want to pick up on your last point about the TREP, because there's so much conversation about that. maybe also misunderstanding of how it's supposed to function, what it's supposed to reflect. Rafael, I would like to turn to you and ask you about what the TREP results have told us thus far. Obviously, we're focused on the presidential election, but there's also two other. There's also Congress is also important for what it means in terms of governability over the next 4 years. Municipalities are also important. So could you talk to us about what we've seen so far, what those races, how we're seeing those two races shape up? What does that mean? And secondly, how do you interpret such a narrow margin between Tito Asfura and Salvador Nasralla, which, at one point there was a difference of 400 votes?
Yes, thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. I think it's very important to speak about how the process has unfolded so far, and we are still looking forward to definitive results in any case. But so far, we can reach some conclusions. I think the first one is that the results in the three elective levels, the presidential, the legislative, and municipalities, show the dominance of the three major political parties in the Honduran political system. And especially in the case of the Liberal Party, because we need to remember that Salvador Nasralla has been a political figure that entered the political system in 2013 with a new political party. He has evolved since through different stages, even reaching an agreement with Libre 4 years ago. But right now, I think due to the circumstances in which we held the general election, well, the first conclusion, the dominance of the three major political parties. But in terms of the presidential race, I think this speaks a lot about how people perceived Libre at this point of the race and after this first time they exercised power, and how Salvador Nasralla made the Liberal Party more competitive than it has been in previous electoral processes. But in the case of the National Party, it's also kind of surprising how 4 years ago, despite all of the context that affected this political organization due to what was happening then to Juan Orlando Hernandez, they reached 1.2 million votes 4 years ago. And we need to still see what's going to be the last result for both parties. But we could conclude based on how the race is going so far that they could actually preserve the electoral base they reached 4 years ago. Now, in terms of the National Congress, again, the three parties will control Congress as they did until, well, this legislative period that is still not finished yet. But I think we still need to see if the Liberal and the National Party are able to reach the votes required for not just simple majority decisions, but also qualified majorities. And so far, it's interesting to see that, for example, 4 years ago, Libre reached at the beginning of this governmental period 50 representatives, and so far, that is the number that the National Party is reaching. So we see how, depending on how the party made at the presidential level, in a way that could actually reflect the amount of votes that party could get in Congress too. And in terms of the municipalities, I believe so far the order is the National Party having the majority of municipalities, then the Liberal Party, and then Libre. This is actually the correlation of power that these three parties had on this current governmental period. So in general, I think it speaks a lot about the control of the political system these three parties have. But I want to end this part with one thing I think it's important to mention. Deborah mentioned that the voting threshold or turnout will approximately be around 65%. An interesting thing is that 4 years ago, the turnout was 68%. So I think it's also important to analyze why around 30% of the voters that are eligible to participate do not participate, and if this could mean also something about not having political alternatives apart from these three major political parties.
Thank you, Rafael. I think that there are other countries in the region where we actually see so many political parties. There's so fragmented, and we're seeing the opposite in Honduras for different reasons. Of course, Giselle, I want to turn over to you. And Rafael was ending his intervention talking about the voter turnout and mentioned that compared to 2021, the voter turnout thus far has not been as high. It was the first time this year, 2025, that 1.4 million Hondurans were eligible to vote. Given your role at El Milenio, can you talk to us about, some of the highlights or some of the trends that you're seeing in the way that these young voters are, voting? What does that tell you in terms of political parties, the way that they're voting?
Yeah, so thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for the invitation this morning. And I think one of the key insights is that first-time voters played a decisive role in shaping the tone of this election, as they did in the 2021 election. Even if overall voter turnout was a bit lower than the last ones, we had about 800,000 Hondurans eligible to vote for the first time, and more than 50% of Hondurans eligible to vote were under the age of 30 years old. So I do believe that this election was defined by young voters, and what specifically stands out for us as a youth organization and something that we've identified working in democratic and electoral initiatives over the past 5 years is that young voters are increasingly more issue driven rather than party driven as other generations are. We tend to prioritize economic stability, transparency, technology, security, and opportunities for employment and education. That even though presidential candidates tend to prioritize it during campaigns, even when they do get to government, they have other priorities. So I think we're seeing a shift away from traditional party loyalty, and Rafa mentioned it briefly as well. Many young voters are skeptical of the long-standing political structures and are more willing to switch their votes depending on who the candidate is at the moment, what the proposals are, and what the issues defining the country at that specific moment are. Something similar happened in 2021. A lot of voters that did not identify with being left wing voted for the current president, Xiomara Castro. And I believe a similar tendency happened in this election where a lot of voters that do not identify with being right wing voted for either Nasri Asfura and Salvador Nasralla, which is more center right. So ideologically, even if they do not fit into those two left-right labels, young voters support more of the social causes that are going on at the moment while demanding different and new approaches. So to clarify or to end, youth voters are becoming more of a swing constituency, which is something very interesting in Honduras, where we define the elections. And even a week before the elections, there are a lot of undecisive voters that were going to be who decided what the shift of the elections was going to be. And the majority of those undecided voters were young voters. So we are more independent. We're also more pragmatic and less tied to the historical political structures that have defined the country, which historically have been the National and the Liberal Party. But since the last 5 to 10 years, a new party came into place, which is the Libre Party, and we're now more of a three-party structure.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing across Latin America that it's not a left versus right kind of mindset that voters have when they go to the ballot boxes, and it's more of, I have these very concrete, tangible problems, the country does, and who's going to fix that? And that's kind of what I would say we're seeing in recent elections. from, the southern cone to now potentially also Honduras. Deborah, I want to bring you back into the conversation and shift gears a little bit, and talk about the armed forces. So in the weeks leading up to the election day, there were concerns, obviously, about the neutrality of the armed forces. Some of the statements that General Roosevelt was saying. There were also clashes between candidates, the representatives before the electoral authorities. How did these dynamics manifest on Sunday? What do you think, these things happening in the background in the weeks leading up to the election, how do you think what do you think that means for confidence in the process?
Thank you. Well, thankfully, the elections were peaceful. And it appears that the armed forces actually carried out their work in a professional manner and according to their constitutional mandate, which is to safeguard the election materials and the ballots and to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. What's interesting is that the role of the armed forces have never been questioned when it came to elections. And this was the first time it was questioned, given remarks by the head of the armed forces. The hope is that beyond these elections now, as the head of the armed forces is due to retire this month, that the armed forces will return to its professional, nonpartisan role. There were certainly more armed forces present, or more visibly present, I would say, during this election process. But as I said, they did act in a professional manner. There were isolated cases, again, of observers, international observers and national observers, that were kicked out on election night right at the vote count, with a misunderstanding, I think, of their ability to be present, that the vote count is public and all citizens. You didn't need credentials to bear witness to the vote count. And the CNE, I think, reacted very quickly, and the president in particular put out a tweet ensuring that the observers were able to get back in for the vote count and continue their work. So I would say that, while this process is not over, it was a very peaceful process right now. And the Hondurans have more confidence, hopefully, in the vote counting and the resolution now of any conflicts.
Deborah, if I may, a quick follow-up question. The process is not over. Does everything point to the armed forces staying within their constitutionally mandated role? Are there any concerns that you've heard on the ground about if something unexpected were to happen in the next few days, that situation could change?
Well, thank you for the follow-up question. It's important detail that many human rights organizations have criticized that the state of exception had been extended through the end of December. December 30th is when the process should conclude with definitive results. And so there is concern because of the military presence on the streets and their mandate to ensure that there are no violent protests. And so I do think there is that lingering concern, and hope. However, everything has been very calm. The candidates, have started to make remarks about their own projections. The leading presidential candidates remain and are calling on their supporters to continue the vote count to the last count. And so I do think that will help maintain the order, and I think that the Hondurans want to go on to celebrate the holidays soon.
Thank you. Giselle and Rafa, I want to ask you, as Hondurans and young Hondurans, the less than 48 hours before election day, President Trump kind of shakes the process with some tweets where he explicitly endorses the candidate from the National Party. And he also then follows that up with a full pardon to Juan Orlando Hernandez. And as of Tuesday, December 2nd, he's been released from prison already in the United States. How, in your view, how did this statement and among your friends, how did this statement play out in the process? How was it perceived domestically?
I can start it off really quickly, Rafa.
Yeah.
I think there is no denying that the United States is and will continue to be one of Honduran's most strategic and important partners and alliances. To me personally, President Trump's endorsement to candidate Nasria Sura was not a surprise, especially to voters, because President Trump is a right-wing president, and he endorsed the most right-wing presidential candidate that we had available in these elections. But what was surprising, at least to me, was the timing of the message because we were already in electoral silence, and also the tone of the message because he did not only endorse a candidate, he spoke out against the two other candidates, which were Rixi Moncada and Salvador Nasrallah. And also, what was very interesting is that Nasria Sura from the National Party dedicated the last 4 years of this campaign into unlinking himself and the National Party from everything that had to do with President or former President Juan Orlando Hernandez, for him and the party to be relinked only 48 hours before the election. And as I mentioned before, there were a lot of undecided voters that consider the US the most important partner for Honduras. That definitely impacted that swing vote. And also, since Honduras also has a very strong private enterprise, a lot of the private enterprise rethink or rethought their vote between presidential candidates Nasria Sura and Salvador Nasrallah, considering the fact that the U.S. publicly endorsed Nasria Sura.
Rafa, what do you think?
Yeah, I think first it speaks a lot about the role the United States plays in Honduran politics historically, not just on the recent past, on like on one hand, but on the other, it was kind of surprising in a way, but because contrary to other countries, for example, you see Trump being very confrontative with Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president. There is tensions have risen a lot. But in the case of Honduras, when the Trump administration came in January, we had a lot of questions on how the current government was going, in this case, the Honduran government, was going to handle the relationship with the Trump administration. And for several months, they were very agile on how to manage the relationship without entering in public controversies with the Trump administration. So when first the Deputy Secretary of State, Christopher Landau, well, he first made a statement with regards to the electoral process. If you see the first two statements, they actually refer to the conditions of the electoral process. So I think it was still a very moderate statement. And then President Trump came in with a very specific line of political positioning, right? So I think in that sense, it was surprising. But then I thought when he issued the second statement in which he again supported Nasria Fura, but at the same time announced the pardon for Juan Orlando Hernandez, I actually thought that was not going to be a good thing for the National Party. So I actually consider the results so far being very surprising in that sense, because as Giselle mentioned, I think that speaks a lot about, on one hand, the weight the United States has politically in the country, but also I mean, the variety of views that people still have here about Juan Orlando Hernandez and the National Party.
Thank you, Rafa. Deborah, as the CNE, the CNE continues to advance the accreditation of results, what will be the most important thing to watch in the coming hours and days to ensure transparency and stability? And actually, the CNE just put out a press release about the trying to read and translate here live, talking about the Juntas Receptoras de Voto, the technical issues that happened yesterday. The company informed the CNE that the acts that were transmitted during the night are still pending and still need to be processed. I'm not sure if you've seen this communique.
I have not.
So what they're saying is that the CNE will continue their technical work. They reiterate their commitment to the results declaration. It will respect the popular will of the country, and that is kind of what they're saying right now. But talking about as we've been discussing, the issues with the company that was contracted for the transmission of results. So going back to the question, the CNE, it's continuing with the vote tallying, moving on to this contingency process as well, where you were talking about those ballots that were perhaps damaged or inconsistent. So what do you think will be the most important thing to watch in the coming hours and days so that the people accept the result at the end of the day?
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of parallel processes that will be happening over the next several days. First, the materials and the ballots arriving at the central place in Tegucigalpa. That started to be received, and the counting physically of the ballots started happening at 10 p.m. last night. There were one political party in particular manifest its concern to national observers yesterday that all of the ballots had not arrived from all of the municipalities in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula in particular. San Pedro Sula is of course, for one political party who is expected to win, is being closely watched and monitored. And for another political party, Tegucigalpa, or two other political parties, perhaps, are closely watching what will happen in Tegucigalpa. The elections are razor thin, and so every vote counts, right? Mm-hmm. And so, as I said before, 13 to 15%, more or less, of the ballots were challenged at the polling stations by political party poll watchers. So that will enter a parallel special scrutiny process. Sometimes that's just numbers, and it's not, correct mathematics, and just making sure that is being compared against the actual acta. I'd also mentioned that there's a small municipality, San Antonio de Flores, and that's in the department of El Paraíso, of about, I understand, Rafael, Giselle, you can correct me, a municipality of about 5,000 citizens. That is along the border of Nicaragua. They have to rehold their vote on this coming Sunday. For whatever reason, the polling stations did not open in that place. But I would say what's crucial now is that transparency remains crucial. And so national observers and international observers alike requested of the CNE yesterday that everyone's credentials be extended and that more credentials be provided, because I think only 3 observers per organization that was credentialed to observe the elections were allowed to stay for this particular process, right? The actual vote counting and the special scrutiny. Observers have requested more because we're talking now thousands of mesas, right, that they would have to oversee over several days. There's always the possibility, and I would say this is what NDI in a pre-election assessment mission in August had pointed out, was the concerns of of legal challenges to this electoral process and the partisan of polarization of the actual electoral institutions. The national election institution is absolutely, is divided into three political parties, as is the newly established electoral justice tribunal that has an important role now in terms of the legal challenges. There is surely to be legal challenges with such a razor-thin election, and it's crucial that international and national observers continue to call on the parties to peacefully await the official definitive results that are expected no later by law by December 30th. The election justice institution needs to be able to carry out its work in a timely fashion, and its rulings need to be respected. The main concern, however, is that has not been conformed, and you may have heard at the OAS Permanent Council meeting, there was questioning of rulings with two out of the three magistrates. And so that we would hope that they are able to conform completely, fully with the three magistrates so that they're able to carry out their job.
Thank you, Deborah. Gisela and Rafael, as we get closer to the last minutes of our event here, I would like to ask you a similar question, and it's about the transparency. What can the CNE do to continue to inspire confidence? What does it need to do to be transparent in the work that it's doing right now, so that come, December 30th at the latest, that everyone accepts the result?
Okay, so in this case, I would say it's important to have a very active communication. I still think, for example, that on Sunday, apart from the political competition of the candidacies, the CNE in a way preserved credibility for at last coming out and saying the preliminary results. But as time goes by and people do not understand what are the next steps from the side of the institutions, then the lack of confidence can increase. And this would not be a new thing for electoral processes in Honduras. So I would say that institutions need to take a grasp of the process, the control of the process, and as Deborah mentioned, not just the CNE, but the National Electoral Tribunal too. I think when the time comes for them to weigh in the process, I think it's important for that institution to try to be as normalized as they could.
Thank you, Giselle.
Yes, I was just gonna add as well. I think the National Electoral Council does have an important role and responsibility of maintaining an active communication. I think, as Rafa said, they did a pretty good job on Sunday. But we still need to, besides the three representatives giving out communications personally on their social medias or coming out on national news, I think it's very important for the population to see them together as an institution, and to have consistent, transparent communication, even if it's online. I also wanted to add that besides the National Electoral Council, it's very important for political parties to be a part of the process. And once the National Electoral Council, which is the only institution as of right now that has the faculty to announce official results of the process, political parties and also political candidates have a responsibility of, if the process is as it has been, which everything has been okay, besides small irregularities, the political parties and political candidates have the responsibility of accepting the process. Even if, they have objections and they show them, they also have the responsibility of if the National Electoral Council declares these results, the political parties and the candidates have the responsibility of also accepting them, because democracy is not only about winning, it's also about knowing how to lose and accepting those results in a very respectful way.
Thank you. Yeah, we have seen, I would say some of the Libre deputies have recognized that Libre's performance during this election was not as strong and robust as they had hoped. Obviously, the face of that party right now, Rixi Moncada, has a different message. And she had a press conference last night where she said she would not concede just yet until every single vote was counted. But I want to thank all three of you for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's watching online. We will continue following the developments in Honduras. Stay tuned to our social media page. And thank you again for joining us.